dominant sources of sediment can sort of be divided up into two major categories. Sediment that is eroding off of farm fields, particularly when there isn't a crop cover on during parts of the year. And the other is sediment that is eroding from the stream banks right along the channels themselves. And of those channel sources, which we call non-field sediment sources, we have bluffs, which are steep, high banks, banks themselves, which are lower features, and then we have ravines, which cut up into the landscape. And each of those can contribute sediment to the river. We know today that the dominant source of the river to the Minnesota River, which is the main source of sediment to Lake Pepin, is from non-field sources, bluffs, banks, and ravines.
The major sources of sediment in the Minnesota River Basin really fall into two groups. There's sediment that's eroded from field, and there's sediment that isn't eroded from field. The stuff that isn't from fields would be things like ravines, bluffs, and stream banks. They're eroding features that are immediately adjacent to the rivers. And the fields are sort of obvious. That's sediment that erodes off the fields. And given that the landscape 150 years ago was prairie, and we plowed it up, and we turned it into fields, which we now see are bare, our intuition tells us that that should be the dominant source of sediment. And when my dad was getting his degree from the University of Minnesota 50 years ago and learning about agriculture and water quality and things, they taught him that the dominant source of sediment in rivers was from fields. And at that time it was probably correct. But it has changed over time. And as we have changed hydrology and we've made more water enter the rivers have become more erosive, and now the dominant source of sediment for the basin as a whole is the erosion of the stream banks and the bluffs. So that source has changed over time, which is in some ways is good because it means we can probably change it back. The other thing that's important to bear in mind is that the dominant source of sediment depends on where you are in the watershed. Those numbers that we know are measured at the outlets of each of the tributaries or Lake Pepin. But as we move farther up into the watershed and we get to the areas that don't have bluffs or as much water to do erosion, then fields become the dominant source. And that's an important managerial distinction. If you've got to manage sediment and you're in the upper portion of a watershed, you're better off to focus there on things that you can do on the fields. If you've got to manage sediment as a whole, or you've got to manage Lake Pepin, then you've got to manage the non-field component.